Good afternoon, morning, evening, whatever it happens to be on your end of the world. My name is Phil Keeling. I'm the host of Meet Your Makers. Today, we are going to be talking with the legendary, the kind to woodland animals, friends to people big and small, game designer, writer extraordinaire, Neall Raemonn Price. How you doing, pal?
I'm doing quite well. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, absolutely. I want to get into this. We always start from the beginning here, as I've mentioned before. We like to go back. So, where did your experience in game design get started?
Oh gosh, game design itself. Well, I have been playing role-playing games for several years, and I sort of gravitated towards the White Wolf games. After a long period of time. How I got into gaming is a longer story back. But eventually, my sort of choice of fantasy game became White Wolf's Exalted. And there was a really passionate Exalted community during first edition and during second edition. And we were able to interact directly with a lot of designers and a lot of writers when they were on the message boards. And I got into a vicious argument with one of those writers and pissed him off so badly that he had to DM me just to continue the argument with me because the moderators on the forum made us stop. And then we became good friends. And eventually he was like, you should start writing for this. And so I did start writing for Exalted. And I was kind of boxed in there. And then eventually I started looking at some of the other stuff that White Wolf and then later Onyx Path did. And I started showing up to the other developers of the other lines and having opinions. And they were like, who is this guy? But eventually I won out through persistence and just kept on writing.
That is kind of the two things that you said there that make perfect sense. First, the big theme that I run into with people who are writing in this industry and just writing in general is persistence. That's kind of just this dogged refusal to take no for an answer from everybody anyway. And the other one is that makes perfect sense is the fact that you got into a vicious argument with people while playing Exalted. That holds up too. I'm not an Exalted guy. It's one of my blind spots, but that one, from what I know of the fan base, passionate people.
Yeah, it can very, very passionate, very Knives Out, even 23 years after the game was released. And it can get pretty vicious to the point where if you like go into another fandom and you start like bringing your Exalted energy into it, they're like, who is this person and why are they coming so hard at me? And I'm like, no, I'm just enjoying the game, guys. And they're like, are you? And I'm like, okay, well.
This is the attitude is different based on the games, I'm sure. I did get ahead of myself. Why don't you tell the people what they might know you for ultimately with this?
Sure. So I, Neall Raemonn Price, have been writing for the better part of 2 decades now in tabletop RPGs and a couple of associated fiction projects around those RPGs. You might know me from a lot of my work on Exalted. You might know me from a lot of my work on the 20th anniversary editions of the World of Darkness games, including Vampire. I was the lead developer and one of the 2 eventual co-developers on Beckett's Jihad Diary, which kind of capped off the 20th anniversary line and summed up the Vampire meta plot. I have done a lot of work through a lot of games of the industry, The Expanse, Legend of the Five Rings. Oh gosh, I know I'm missing a ton of work in here. Scion 2nd Edition is obviously a really big one. I was the one who kind of kicked that off, and I was probably the principal designer on the story path system that Scion and Trinity use. Not Story Path Ultra, that's Danielle Lazon is the lead developer of that, and she took all the lessons learned from the system over the years and all the designers on that and made something even better. But it's their horse now, not mine. So
I do want to point out that the way we met was I was at PAX Unplugged, and we were going to play a game of Mummy, and I don't remember what happened. There was some sort of mix up with the adventure or something, and you went, well, do you guys want to play Scion? I was like, yes, I'll play Scion with you. Like that sounds delightful. Yes, let's do that.
I also wrote on Mummy. I wrote on both editions of Mummy. So a lot of work in the classic, a lot of work in sort of the classic World of Darkness, and also the new / Chronicles of Darkness. That's really the bulk of my career has been with a lot of White Wolf. But I have taken a lot of steps out in other companies. I did a little bit of work for Paizo, a little bit of work for Wizards of the Coast, and others out there.
That's great. What were some of your first game experiences?
So for a long time, I didn't play super published games. My introduction to role-playing games was when I was 15, and I was a counselor at Boy Scout camp. Mm-hmm. And one of the fellow campers was running a West End game Star Wars game, and I was like, oh, this is amazing.
Nice.
But he had made some modifications to it and some stuff like that, so it wasn't like strictly from the books. But I still thought it was so fascinating. And another counselor who later became one of my best friends over the last 2 decades was like, I write role-playing games myself, and I do that. And so I was like, oh, cool. So, for years and years, him, me, his cousin, his best friends, we all gamed in his basement for just playing his kind of homebrew games, which was just an almost proto-apocalypse world style game with just rolling 2d6 and kind of comparing it against a difficulty. And we did that for a couple of years, but eventually I was like, I'm really into these World of Darkness games. I think they're really cool. Can we try one of them? Can I try running a game? And they're like, well, we don't play this Orpheus game, but maybe you could run Demon the Fallen. That sounds cool. And I was like, cool. And they broke that game wide open within 2 sessions. But so I was such a pushover. I was like, sure, you can design your own demon forms, and yeah, you can play the world's greatest assassin who now is a demon. Like that, of course, that's totally fine character thing to play. It was not. It was a dumb idea. They blew up demons with C4, and it was ridiculous.
I know exactly what you mean. I was usually the only person interested in gaming in most of I was an army brat, and we moved a lot, and so I ran into a lot of people who were intrigued but didn't know how to play, and I would teach them how to play D&D and stuff like that, and I just wanted them to play so bad that I go, sure, you can play a Celestial. Of course you can have a Vorpal broadsword. Why not? And it just absolutely explodes in your face in that situation. So
yeah,
that makes fun. Sense. What's that?
We had fun. We still talk about that game. So.
Oh, yeah. It's a good time. It's absolutely a good time. So what was your first kind of break into the industry? What was your first project that you got picked up for?
So I did some uncredited work on some Exalted books, talking with the writers and just sort of like hashing stuff out and trying some stuff like that. But my first actual break, when I finally sent in an official submission and worked through all that, was Manual of Exalted Power, the Infernals. Now, the Infernals were a new Exalted type for 2nd edition. They'd been kind of teased in 1st edition, but they hadn't really been there. And then, I finally got to work on these cool sort of Faustian super demigods for 2nd edition and really do that. And I was helping another writer with the Charms chapter, but I got assigned to do the storytelling chapter, which I kind of thought was always the part that you skip in books. And I was like, well, okay. So I did my damnedest to make it really interesting and like really drill in what kind of stories you're supposed to tell. And it taught me a very early lesson about how to find my own voice and how to find my own knack in talking to people through game writing and where the line is between communicating things through fiction and communicating things through mechanics and communicating things just directly like looking the reader in the eye and saying, this is how you should play the game.
Mm-hmm. Where do you find the line there? I see with a lot of writers that's the toughest part, especially for people who are game masters, that railroading versus freedom. Like, where's the line? Exalted,
I'm very fortunate to have cut my teeth on Exalted, because Exalted's power scale ramps up so quickly and so suddenly and sharply in so many different directions that it's very famously hard to write adventures for Exalted, because any Exalt type can effectively break the adventure just by doing something with one of their cool powers. So you have to be very, very good at improv. You have to really understand how to scale up and account for the powers of your players in the game that you're doing. My first draft of that storytelling chapter had a sidebar in it called "Your game is stupid and you are stupid," and the developer cut it. Which in my dotage, I'm like, okay, that was a good idea.
That's fine. Yeah.
That's I'll color that anecdote with another anecdote about the classic World of Darkness and the new World of Darkness. When the old World of Darkness games ended in 2004, White Wolf was going to be like, okay, we're going to put out this new book about, with a new system based on the old one, and we're going to have a standalone book with those mechanics and then the different splat type books. And it's like, cool. And so in classic World of Darkness, I don't know how much of it you played, but there's a stat called willpower that gives you an automatic success. And willpower is extremely hard to get. Excuse me, my cat is...
Cats are welcome on this show. My cat is constantly trying to join on the show. All cats are friends here.
There's a stat called willpower that it's very hard to regenerate. And you had these two traits called nature and demeanor. Nature is how you present yourself. Demeanor is how you present yourself to the outside world, and nature is how you truly are on the inside. Yep. And you would have to hit a specific role-playing trigger with your nature in order to actually regenerate willpower. But unfortunately, they were very inconsistently written. Some natures would be like, you regenerate willpower on any day that ends with a Y. Right. And another nature would be, you regenerate willpower anytime you defy God and fly. And it's like, what?
Right.
So one of those is obviously much more useful than the others.
Defying and flying. Yep.
Yeah, and so, but then when Chronicles of Darkness, New World of Darkness, that system came out, you had willpower in there, and it works slightly differently. But you're like, okay, this is a really precious resource. But instead of nature demeanor, you have these things called virtue and vice. And vice, if you fulfilled your vice, you got one willpower back. If you filled your virtue, you got all of your willpower back. And they were, in theory, much easier to trigger. The intended game loop, the actual game loop that you were supposed to go through, is you were supposed to be pinging your vice pretty constantly, like indulging it in character, and then like chasing your virtue. And you were supposed to be using willpower on any roll, like any roll that's important, because the dice pools were so much lower and the target numbers were always so much higher. So you'd start playing the game as a veteran of the old system, and you'd be like, I'm not succeeding on anything. Like, this is hard. This is real tough. And it's like, no, you're supposed to be using willpower and everything. You're supposed to be chasing these two things to regenerate your willpower. Nowhere in the book is that explained. Like, nowhere in the book is that actually said directly to the reader. Like, you are supposed to be doing this. You should be doing that. And the lesson that I worked into Exalted, and the lesson that I took from years later from that anecdote being told to me, is that it never actually hurts to just like look your reader in the eyes and spell out what the core gameplay loop should be.
Right.
Like, you should be doing this. It's okay to do that. And at the same time, your mechanics have to reinforce that and like drive people towards that loop. and at the same time, your fiction has to reflect to that as well. So one of the big things for world building and playing role-playing games that I found is that it always has to kind of be in service to the game. A lot of people get into this and they want to tell a story or explain the way that things work, and that's not. They think of the game second to that, to the story that they're telling. And in a weird way, D&D both is very good for this and very bad for this, because if your story is about hunting through a dungeon and finding stuff, that's great. But for everything else, D&D doesn't do that well in. And people are always trying to make D&D do things other than what it's good at.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the kind of the history of it. That's how it's evolved over the years. You know, when you look at the way that D&D was meant to be played in the late 70s and early 80s, that is not the game that is on Critical Role right now. You know, that is a totally different game.
Yeah, and you see talk about Kickstarters for like this is a Regency romance game using 5e, and I'm like, is that really the best system for that?
Right.
Is that the best chassis you want to do? Like, I don't play Bridgerton to kick down the castle and like steal the treasure of the king.
Right.
I mean, it would spice Bridgerton up a good bit, I think, right.
But yeah, it's like there. I mean, that's one of the advantages of the world of gaming that we're in right now. There are so many different systems, and that's what you just want to share them as much as possible.
Yeah,
I've got a couple of questions here in the chat. As long as we were talking a little bit about Scion there in the past, we have. I'm not even going to try to pronounce this, my friend. There's so many letters in there. But I had a question about early development of Scion 2nd Edition. Were virtues supposed to be more deeply tied to fate bindings than they were in the final release?
Yes. One of the great. So any game you go through, and I think when you get to a certain point as a designer, you're going to design a game, and you're going to be really proud of a lot of it. But by the time you're done designing it and a couple books are out, you're like, I would have designed this much differently. I would have done a lot of things differently. For Scion 2nd Edition, we both had to build Scion as a setting, and as we had to build the story path system as well to support that setting. And story path was deliberately built with a bunch of what are another writer, Malcolm Shepard, referred to as levers. And those are just basically little mechanical widgets built into the game that other people can hang other mechanics off of. And no game is intended to use all of those mechanics, but they're sort of baked into the system at the start so that you can use them if you want to. And there's pluses and minuses of this kind of game design. But Scion 2nd Edition starts with a lot of bells and whistles that aren't always utilized by even the core book itself and even later parts of the games. Virtues, I wish I had tied them in a little more sharply, sort of the way that Powered by the Apocalypse does balance. They're kind of convergent game designs that we both hit upon that idea. And Mass, I think Mass does it a lot better than Scion does. I think Avatar is another good Powered by the Apocalypse game that does the sort of virtue idea a little bit better than the way that 1st edition Scion does it. Or sorry, 2nd edition Scion does it. My edition Scion does it. But they were fundamentally meant to be a role-playing hook that kind of drove your character between two poles and the two defining elements of your mythological narrative. So every Scion character is not just a character in the game, and they're not just beholden to the narrative of the game. They're beholden to the sort of narrative that defines their pantheon, and that is a construct within the world. It's a meta construct within the game itself. And so they are constantly just being driven between two sort of opposing but not necessarily opposite forces back and forth. And which one they choose at any one time is going to be beneficial to their character or not. And I think a lot of that comes through, and I think again, now that you designed the system, and there's a dozen Scion second edition books out now, I'm like, I think there's more elegant ways to do this. I think there's sharper ways to drive that kind of design. And that's how all game design is. And that's how all editions are. Every edition of a new game is a reaction to the older editions of that game. And you're like, there's more elegant ways to do this. There's sharper ways to do that. And now that people have been playing it for years on years and years, and thousands of people have played it, you're like, okay, I have a lot more playtest data than I did even when I playtested the game.
Yeah, yeah. People, especially nowadays on the internet, people talking and complaining and, you know, throwing out their own ideas. And have you ever noticed times when, like, homebrew rules for someone else's games become official rules? I love reading about stuff like that. You hear about that every now and then. People basically just taking people play a certain way so frequently that it actually works its way into a new edition of the system. I love hearing about stuff like that.
Yeah, writers are people. They pay attention to this sort of stuff. They like hearing about it. And if everyone's just playing these things anyway, then yeah, you know, you always have that one person who like loves the old way of doing it and does it that whole time. 99 people will be like, this is a stupid way to do it. Let's house rule it this way. And you're like, cool. And next edition, you just make that a base rule. And there's that one person who was like, I love doing it that way. And my whole group had no problem doing it. And it was, I don't understand why any sensible person would get rid of this rule. And it's like, okay, all right.
Yeah.
Enough out of you.
Well, I mean, there's also the little, your own little personal attachment to. A great example for me is the blood system in Vampire the Masquerade versus the most recent edition's hunger system, which is cleaner, is a great rule. It is a good design choice, but I miss having my little red glass beads that I would use for my blood points. I miss that. That's my little bag of blood. I miss having that. That's fun to me.
Yeah, it is really interesting, and it kind of the hunger check system kind of evolved from Vampire the Requiem's atrocity dice in their Dance Macabre system. And there's a really interesting mechanic in there of like the gambler's fallacy. How long can I keep this streak going? Like, how long can I keep going there? And in theory, and that's always in theory, it's never in practice. In theory, you could get more out of rouse checks as long as you keep making them than you could with blood points. Mm-hmm. And statistically, you are never going to do that, but right. You think to yourself, maybe I can beat the odds. Yeah. And that's what gets people like going to do it. And I appreciate that bit of design because I'm like, that's clever. I like people, you know, I like seeing people fall into that.
Yeah, it's human nature. It makes perfect sense. You know, I can beat the odds. I just got to roll these dice, and I love that. I totally agree. It makes perfect sense. We got another one here. How do you manage, and this is a good question, how do you manage through so many games in such a short amount of time? Your dedication as co-founders of a publishing company impress me.
How do I manage to make
so many games in such a short amount of time?
Oh, well, I don't own Onyx Path Publishing, it's okay. I was a freelance designer for many different game companies. So it comes down to really, you know, speaking for them, I think, or not speaking for them as it were, but speaking as someone who worked with them for many years. It really comes down to having a diverse group of skills. It comes down to knowing a lot of designers, and it comes down to knowing designers who also read a lot of other games. Mm-hmm. There's a point. There's a point when you're a freelance writer and a game designer. There's a point where you stop being a pure fan of something, and you're like, oh, I'm getting to do this, and I'm creating things, and I'm really good. And it's you know, that never goes away, but your concept and your conception of it just becomes larger. So that's a much smaller piece. You start thinking about things critically. You start thinking about things about like, how does this serve the game itself? How does this work in the meta context of the game? And not every game designer or writer actually makes that conceptual leap. I'm not going to name names, but some people have taken over game lines, and suddenly their favorite clan or tribe or Legion of Space Marine becomes the best in the fiction and in the mechanics, and you're like, okay, all right. Or sometimes, that someone will buy a game line and suddenly their favorite things work their way into the fiction of the game line, even though it makes no sense and is kind of detrimental to the whole idea of it. Mm-hmm. I'm sure your readers are smart enough to read between the lines on a lot of what I just said.
Oh yeah.
But sometimes people just don't think critically. They're not able to think about the meta. They're not able to think about things as designers. Mm-hmm. And that's a step that was really important, I think, for me to take, and I've seen a lot of other people make that step as well, and it's always good to see. Once you start doing that, you can't turn that part of your brain off, and you start reading other games, and you are enjoying them as a fan, and enjoying them for the fiction and everything. But you're also thinking, like, what is this doing? What is it doing in the fiction? What are the mechanics doing? What are the themes of this? And once you see how well they do it, you're just like, okay, I can steal that.
Oh yeah. I think it makes sense for anyone to take a look at the author page on a lot of these books and assume that people like you and Matthew and Eddie and that sort of thing are all like basically the co-founders of this team, though, because there is a level of face time that Onyx Path has always been good about with its creators that I think is really terrific, and it shows that it shows the core strength of Onyx Path, I think, which is that it is about everybody who's involved. It is this team effort. It is about every individual member of the group. So I think that's an easy leap to take.
Yeah.
Now, you were talking, you actually bring me to my next question there. I like to ask about franchises that our designers have worked on, projects that you've been a part of that maybe you were a fan of and that sort of thing. And like, what are some franchises maybe that you were just desperate to work on? But now that I've asked Travis and a couple of other people that, and they very properly pointed out, I think sometimes I love these franchises and therefore I don't want to work on them, if that makes sense. I just want to leave them alone. So now we're going to break it down into the tiers. Are there franchises that you would really like to sink your teeth into and work on that larger scale level you were talking about? And are there some franchises that you're just like, you know what, I love this as a fan too much, I don't want to touch it?
I should tell your readers that I am at least semi-retired at this point, and I got a big Mage the Awakening tattoo on me as sort of my sending off gift for writing on things, and I keep getting dragged into a couple little tiny projects here and there after that, but for the most part, I'm like, oh, I'm retired. And there's always really cool new franchises that are coming out or being done. I mentioned before Avatar, like I love Avatar, and Magpie did a really great job with the new edition. I know a lot of the people who've worked on it. I am pretty positive if I went and like begged for some work, I could get it, but I'm like, I don't. That's their stuff now. Mm-hmm. That's not something I want to. It's not something I necessarily want to pursue. It's less being a huge fan of it and more prioritizing other things in my life.
Sure.
That I want to do. Because as a kid, I was doing all these homebrew games with my friends, as I was mentioning, but I saw this video game in a store one day called Vampire the Masquerade Redemption. and I bought it and I played it, and then I'm on this cool night in the Middle Ages, and I become a vampire, and then I'm in the modern day, and I'm like, oh, this is amazing. And then I found out it's a role-playing game, and I was like, oh, wow. So I went to my local role-playing game shop, which I had to look up, and this was like 1999, 2000. So barely had an internet presence. And they didn't have a copy of Vampire, but they did have a copy of Wraith: The Oblivion. Oh. And I was like, well, this is close enough. And man, that's a dark game.
That is a dark game.
That's a super dark game. But I loved it. And then I bought Demon, and then we played Demon for 3 sessions, and we got into Exalted afterwards because I was like, okay, and Exalted was perversely more difficult to break because it's so easy to break. It breaks instantly, so it's already broken. That's what you're playing with. That's one of my favorite game lines is Orpheus, which came out in 2003, kind of leading up to the end of it, and was sort of a successor capstone to Wraith. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I wish I could have written on that miniseries. But then they did the Wraith the Oblivion 20th Anniversary Edition, and there was a whole ass appendix for Orpheus, and I more or less grabbed Rich Gansky by the lapels, metaphorically speaking, and was like, let me write this. And I got to write it, and it was cool. So you've got Vampire, you've got Wraith, and Orpheus, in there. You've got Exalted. All these games that were so formative to my early gaming experience that I loved purely as a fan before I became a designer and expanded that. I've already gotten to work on them. I've already made my mark. I've written stuff that is canon. I've written stuff that I've had to argue with other people about on forums because they're like, this isn't what the writer intended. And I'm like, I wrote that. And I even committed the terrible cardinal sin of this is a do as I say, not as I do story. The sin of arguing with someone on the internet about rules and having a disagreement and then going into the next book and writing that rule, my interpretation of the rule in there.
But how satisfying that must have been, though.
It's satisfying, but it's also petty. And once you make that designer leap, I hadn't quite made it yet. Once you make that leap, you're like, this is beneath you. You should not do it. So do not do that, aspiring writers. But it was satisfying. It was so petty and so great.
You had to really scrub the dirt off afterwards. Yeah. But damn.
If you wonder why solar animas do count as sunlight, that's why.
I love it. So what are some of your favorite... I asked this question, and I find it really funny, because right off the bat when I started this show, I think it was Champ pointed out, like we're writers. That's kind of a funny question to ask, but I always like to know, are there any pre-made modules or campaigns or anything like that that you really love, that you've run, maybe you want to run, that sort of thing? It is a funny question to ask somebody who writes stuff, but sometimes that's what you want. Sometimes you just want something prepackaged.
So, without hashing on anyone, without bashing anyone, I find a lot of pre-made modules to be really straitjacketed. Mm-hmm. And I find that once you have a really experienced group of role players, or even just a very good group of role players from the get-go, you quickly start having to improvise stuff in modules. You quickly start having to write other things. And the best modules to me essentially present an inciting incident and then give you a sort of timeline of what happens if the players don't intervene, and what they're, and then gives you very interesting and elegant avenues for the PCs to make their mark on there. So I would say that the first campaign that really did that successfully that I did run was in a book called Time of Tumult for Exalted. And it was a module called Crusaders of the Machine God, which introduces the alchemicals into creation and essentially deals with a group of robot Exalted from another dimension invading the world of Exalted. So you have this kind of Bronze Age-ish post-apocalypse Exalted setting, and then suddenly robots, right? Mm-hmm. And other Exalted just invading and stealing natural resources. And it's very cool because it gives a very long timeline, like a 10-year timeline of when these guys come in, what they're doing, how long these things take. And then at each step, there are avenues of when the PCs get involved, what do they do? Because, like I mentioned with Exalted, once the PCs start doing things, it'll go off the rails. There are no rails anymore. So you only build the rails to illustrate where the whole thing is going, and you expect it to jump off the rails at any point. Too many like long, even like thick adventure books, I think, you'll just go into it and you'll start it, and then it'll expect you to go from A to Z, in a nice, neat little line, and maybe it'll have a sidebar of like, what if they don't do that? And it's like, well, then blah 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 blah, and it's like, I think a really effective module design never plots it that way, and never plots it that on like that. It says these things are going to happen. Here are how the players can affect them. It's something that both respect player agency, but also makes it seem like it's bigger than the players.
Yeah.
Right. So long story short, there are two modules that I think are really excellent in doing this. Mm-hmm. One is Eyes of the Stone Thief for 13th Age. That is about a living dungeon, like a bigger than a Tarrasque-sized dungeon monster that has been roaming the countryside for centuries, eating towns and dungeons and like digesting them and like placing them in parts of itself. And the inciting incident is that it eats something that's the players are invested in, like your hometown or where your mom lives or something like that. And you have to like raid the thing and basically tickle its adenoids and make it barf up the town in a slightly different location, and saving the people. But once you've done that, the thing remembers you. It's alive, and it's going to keep coming after you and the players. And so it's both, a layout of the dungeon itself, of the inside of it, and the factions and people living within it. And some of them have been living there for dozens of years and generations, and also the effects on the outside world. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't assume that there's a linear path between any of those things. The other one that does this really well is the Dracula dossier for Knights Black Agents. It has a very cool system called the Conspiramid that is actually a mechanical system for making a conspiracy react to player actions. So what the people on the other side will do in response to players doing things and how aggressive it is. And I find that building a system like that and detailing a conspiracy or an enemy faction really thoroughly and being very clear about their motives and their timeline and their own goals, something like that is much more effective for an adventure because it says no matter what the PCs do, they'll react to it some way. Mm-hmm. And here's how they would react to these different things. So it's really teaching you as the GM how to improv and giving you the tools to do that, because that's what you're going to have to do with that, no matter what.
I do find that you're seeing that more and more, especially in Onyx Path games. I'm noticing the thing that pops into my head is they came from games. I find that the campaign ideas and that sort of thing that you get out of those tend to be far less. Here's a map, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and go to each section when you get to this area. And it's more of a free-flowing kind of like, here's what the world's about, here's what this guy's about, here are the things that could happen. And it doesn't hold your hand so much as it preps you for what your players can and might do, which is honestly way more effective, because who hasn't DM'd or story-told a game where the players completely defy every expectation you have in terms of what they could possibly do? You give them 4 choices and they find 7 or 8 more. I think that's just way more effective, and a way more effective way of doing things anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. Just as a shout out, the recently passed Janelle, I believe her last name is pronounced Jaquays. She really pioneered a lot of this design and a lot of these, the way these nonlinear kind of dungeons are designed for early D&D and AD&D. And so I definitely recommend anyone who wants to become interested in the roots of this design, like soup to nuts, go back and study some of her work, and then look at the more modern things. And it also kind of reinforces how young this industry is. Mm-hmm. We're just coming up now on the 50th year of D&D and the 50th year of that, and that's awesome. That's really, really cool. But movies have been around for like 120 years, and how much longer have these other things been around for? So as a form, and this is still a very young hobby.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's part of what makes it so exciting. There's so much going on. Okay. Now, we've talked a lot about game design, gaming, that sort of thing. You have mentioned already that you are pretty much retired, 90%, 85% retired at this point. What are you working on now? What will you tell us that you're working on now?
So I'm working on novels and short fiction as my sort of creative outlet. I'm pursuing a graduate degree, my master's, and I'm spending more time with my family. Mm-hmm. I'm spending more time at home. I'm spending more time consuming media as well. When you're a designer, you are what you eat, and that includes your media diet. And sometimes when I was really thick in the design or doing 2 or 3 different games, all I would read is other role-playing games, and or all I would read was old books of this thing. And I didn't have a lot of time for novels. I didn't have a lot of time for other short stories. And there's been such great fiction coming out in the last couple of years, or movies and TV shows that I've just never watched and never caught up on. So now I'm catching up on it, and that's great.
That is a good feeling. I think that the inherent tragedy of being able to work in any creative field comes from the fact that you're working in it, and that's the thing you love, but what do you do to relax when the thing you relax with is now work? It's something I've run into with a lot of game designers.
And that critical design part of your brain never gets turned off. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, it's once you've made that conceptual leap, as I was talking about, from fan to designer, that internal critic will never shut up. You will always forevermore be looking at a game or a piece of fiction or whatever and being like, are the mechanics pushing the high concept? Does this support that? And I got to tell you, Phil, nothing annoys me more than reading a piece of fiction in a role-playing game and then not being able to do the thing in the fiction in the mechanics.
What's even the point? What's even the point? Yeah.
What's even the point? Yeah. I recommend a lot of new aspiring designers read some of the role-playing game and writing advice from Brandon Sanderson, who does all the Cosmere stories. He's known for very intricate, diverse magic systems, and for some people, I think that takes the mystery out of it. But the way he writes it, it's more of a tool in which you figure out how to solve parts of the story. And so I think it's really worthwhile to take a look at something like that when you're designing magic or something for a role-playing game. And that's one of the big things. A lot of times people would come up to me, especially in the earlier parts of my career, and be like, I want to write for role-playing games, but I'm a writer. I'm not a game designer. I don't do mechanics. And it's like, well, what are you even doing here? Why don't you just go write a novel?
Yeah.
Like go do that. A role-playing game is a role-playing game, and you're participating in the fiction, but you're also doing so within that structure. So.
Oh yeah. I totally agree. So, do you have any books or media that are non-gaming related that you would recommend budding designers to get into?
If you can find a used copy of Orson Scott Card's How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy, I highly recommend you pick it up. I say used because Orson Scott Card himself has some very, very bad political views.
Yeah.
But he wrote this book before he started espousing a lot of those, and the advice is really good, even if the man himself is not. So if you can find a used copy that doesn't give him money, please pick that up. I find the best games and the best fiction are when you have something to say. This doesn't necessarily mean something outside of your own experience or something like that. When they say write what you know, it doesn't mean write about a struggling writer trying to do something. It means there's something everyone has in this world to say and has a really passionate experience about, or something that they want to get out, and write that. Write that as a fantasy novel. Write that as a cyberpunk dystopia. Write that as something, a collection of short stories. But always have that sort of theme and the thing you want to say in mind, and read stuff that's related to that. Mm-hmm. If you want to write about urban New York or something like that, read stories and stuff set in there. Read fiction novels, read nonfiction novels that are set in New York. Listen to music about what's set in New York. I once wrote a story about Demon the Descent that is almost entirely based on the lyrics of Bleecker Street by Simon and Garfunkel, because I heard the song and I was like, I really like this song. I really like it. And so I just started thinking about the imagery in the song and just sort of writing that into the story that's in early 1960s Bleecker Street, New York. And I had to do a shocking amount of research for this 5,000 word story to get Bleecker Street right, because I wanted to get it right. But it felt good. I went there and I looked at the structure of the street and I was like, oh, okay. So yeah.
I love doing that kind of research. That kind of thing just it feeds into the whole process. It's they say you should write every day, and I think that's great advice, but I also think that kind of research that counts. That to me is the same kind of thing. It really feeds into something inherent about writing and creating.
Absolutely.
All right, we've got one more question in the chat that we're going to throw your way, and let's see. I had a Mage Awakening question too, so get your tattoo ready. Can you give the room your thoughts on the Free Council? You wrote inspiring fiction for them back in the day.
Okay, so the Free Council kind of got stereotyped in first edition as the technological ones. Every other mage order was mystical and traditional and drew from Atlantis. And the Free Council were like, we're the new technomancers in that. And no matter how much later designers were tried to be like, no, mages can use smartphones, it's okay. They're like, oh, that's Free Council stuff. A lot of fans, they just stuck in the minds of a lot of fans. Dave Brookshaw put together the setting Bible and the initial design for second edition, and so a lot of the stuff I'm going to now claim as my own is actually due to him. But from this point on, I will happily steal it. But it was really important to look at the Free Council as a contrast to the larger section of the order, the Diamond. The Diamond orders, for those who don't quite aren't familiar with Mage, you have 6 orders in the world, big magic groups you can belong to. 4 of them have existed since essentially the first couple centuries, BC, since the time of Alexander, and the Free Council was created at the start of the 20th century, and the Seers of the Throne, the enemy faction, really got its stuff together in the Renaissance, and maybe a little bit after. But so you've got 4, and then you've got a 5th one that's allied with the 4, and you've got a 6th one that hates all of them. In the first edition, the Pentacle, the 4+1, was really considered this kind of unified entity, but there would always be the little asterisk, but they all kind of don't like the Free Council. And I wanted to really play up the fact that the Pentacle is a kind of artificial alliance. These four orders have worked together for millennia at this point, and parts of their philosophy and their magical praxis have bled into one another and reinforce it. So if you look at the orders carefully in 2nd edition Mage, you can see the diamond ones. Each of them has little snippets of the other's beliefs and philosophies sprinkled into their core philosophy. So it's self-reinforcing, and they are unified, right? And the Free Council are not the Johnny-come-latelys, but they're everyone who didn't buy, over and over the millennia, who didn't buy into the Diamond's praxis. They didn't buy into the Diamond's way of doing things. They didn't believe in that. The Diamond is fundamentally it's Platonian. It believes in as above, so below. There are perfect forms that exist above us in the magical realm that we draw down and influence what's here. And the Free Council is like, no. It's as below, so above. Human culture and human societies create that realm up above us, and that's what we kind of reinforce in a loop. And so these are obviously two fundamentally different philosophies. But then in the Free Council, so then what you have is that one kind of overarching idea, as below, so above. But it brings together a lot of people under a big tent. You bring together like New Age techno-mages. You bring together cultural traditions of magic that don't fit into the Diamond, but it has existed for many, many, many years. And they're all one big happy family, supposedly, but they're not. And so one of the other stereotypes in 1st edition is they were very fractitious, and I found that was a really easy way to play that up for 2nd edition. To be like, you have people in here who literally have a magic tradition that dates back to the Stone Age, or Dreamtime mages from Australia who've been doing this for 35,000 years, and then you've got Jewish Kabbalists who've been doing it for 5,000 years, and then you've got New Age techno-mages who basically made it up out of whole cloth in the 1950s and now use smartphones. And in theory, they're all under one order, but they don't necessarily play well with each other on a very fundamental level. And they also believe in like radical non-hierarchy. So you have these couple of unifying things, and you have these ideas come together, and it was really important to give them their own identity and just reinforce at every single point in the fiction that they're separate from the Diamond. The Pentacle, quote unquote, is an artificial alliance. It is an alliance and not a unified entity. And I sometimes had to go to other writers and like be like, hey, not to comment on your draft too much, but you're saying it's a unified entity. It's not. It is not at all. And that's another thing that's really good about collaborative work, is the ability to give feedback to other writers as well. And it's important to do that nicely.
Oh, yes.
Because if you don't do that nicely, then nobody wants to work with you again. You're a dick. I think Neil Gaiman said, the key, I'm paraphrasing him very badly, but the key to getting work is do work really well, do it on time, and be really nice about it. And you can get away with 2 out of those 3.
Yes.
But you can't get away with only one of them.
Yeah. Yeah. People, you'd be amazed at what people will put up with if you're on time and friendly. It's fascinating. It really is. Yeah.
I tried to go with the friendly and doing work well, and sometimes I only managed doing work well, and those were some low points in my career.
Oh,
but you can on to doing things friendly pretty quickly, and once you're that, things work out better.
I definitely tried. I'm definitely in that camp. I more likely than not am friendly and decent work. It might not be on time.
Yeah, I love deadlines. I love the sounds they make as they whoosh by.
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. All right. Well, this has been fantastic, Neal. Thank you so much for being on the show. Is there anything else you want to share with the room before we head off? Anything you want to guide young minds with, or I'm assuming there are.
So I keep saying I'm retired. I'm semi-retired. The door's always open, I think, for me to come back or do something new or do something else. There's a lot of avenues for people to publish their own work and get a little bit of cash back for it. Fundamentally, this is always going to be a labor of love. It's not a hobby that makes the big buku bucks. Someone. You mentioned Critical Role before. There was a brouhaha like about a year ago when they're like, Critical Role made $12 million over 2 years. That's incredible. And I'm like, if for a production for people living in LA, that is not incredible.
That's nothing.
That is nothing. That is nothing. This is not an industry that makes a ton of money, but it is an industry that drives a lot of creative outlet and demands a lot of creative energy out of you. So my advice to anyone writing for a living wage is find something else to write and find something else to do, because this is a hobby and a labor of love. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it at all. Mm-hmm. What that means is that you need to use that to sharpen other parts of your life and to sharpen other skills. I've gotten jobs because my resume has 20 years of technical writing experience. Because, I wrote a lot of stuff on spec, on time, to a very specific set of parameters, which, role-playing games have to be. Yep. So, hey, it's technical writing. And they're like, wow, you're a technical writer. I'm like, yes. So, think of ways to leverage interdisciplinary competence. Think about ways to bring in other parts of your life into your games, and your games into other parts of your life, and it'll never go stale. You'll never find yourself running into a wall.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Neal, and thank you guys very much for joining us, Neal. Where can they find you? Should they find you?
You can find me at Burnt Neal, BURNTNEALL, on the X, formerly Twitter. But I should have a website coming up pretty soon. So
good deal. And in the meantime, my name is Phil Keeling. I am the co-host of the podcast Pixel Lit, the greatest podcast about video game novelizations, and the only podcast about video game novelizations. We've cornered the market. So join us, find us wherever podcasts are processed, slaughtered, skinned, and put in safe, sterile packaging for your consumption. In the meantime, we will see you guys later. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.